welcome back to Teen Story Share. This week we're reading our fifth and final chapter of A Northern Light by Jennifer Donnelly, and next month we'll be moving on to a new book. And if you missed any of the previous chapters, those will be linked down below. In this chapter we're going to jump back to the past and learn a bit more about Maddie's life on the farm before she started working at the hotel. Misnomer. Nothing on our entire farm, not the bulky hay wagon, not the stumps in the north field, not even the rocks in the lower meadow, was as unyielding, as immovable, as adamant and uncompromising as Pleasant the mule. I was in our cornfield trying to get him to pull the plow. "Giddy up, Pleasant, giddy up," I shouted, snapping the reins against his haunches. He didn't move. "Come on, Pleasant, come on, mule," Beth wheedled, holding a lump of maple sugar out to him. "Here, boy, here, mule," Tommy Hubbard called, waving an old straw hat. Pleasant liked to eat them. "Move your fat ass, you jackass," Lou swore, tugging on his bridle. But Pleasant would not be budged. He stood firm, dipping his head occasionally to try to bite Lou. "Go on, Pleasant, please, Pleasant," I begged. It was dry and remarkably warm for the start of April, and I was tired and dirty and dripping with sweat. The muscles in my arms ached and my hands were raw from guiding the plow, and I was just as mad as a hornet. Pa had kept me home from school again, and I'd wanted to go so badly. I was waiting on a letter, one that was going to come care of Miss Wilcox, if it came at all, and it was all I could think about. I told him I had to go. I said my exams were coming up. I said I needed to study my algebra. I told him Miss Wilcox was making us read Paradise Lost, and that it was hard going and that I would fall behind if I missed a day. Didn't make a bit of difference. He'd been reading the signs. No fog in February, no thunder in March, a south wind on Good Friday, and was convinced the mild weather would hold. Most people planted corn around Decoration Day at the end of May, but Pa wanted to plant mid-month at the latest, and he wanted to start working the soil early too. There are only about 100 frost-free days in the North Woods, and corn takes time to ripen. Pa was trying to build our dairy herd. He wanted to keep the calves if he could rather than sell them, but we couldn't keep them if we couldn't feed them, and we couldn't feed them unless we grew enough corn. I was to have 2 acres turned over that day, and I'd only gotten a third of the way through before Pleasant decided it was quitting time. If I didn't finish, Pa would want to know why. Plowing was Lawton's job, but Lawton wasn't around to do it. Pa would have done it if he could, but he was with Daisy, who was calving, so it fell to me. I bent down and picked up a stone. I was just winding up to throw it at Pleasant's behind when I heard a voice behind me say, "Peg him with that and you'll scare him. He's like to run. Take himself that plow and you across the field and through the fence." I turned around. A tall, blond boy was standing at the edge of the field, watching me. He was taller than I remembered, broad-shouldered, and handsome. Handsomest one out of all the Loomis boys. He had the rim of a wagon wheel resting on his shoulder, his arm poked through the spokes. "Hey, Royal," I said, trying to keep my eyes from roosting on any one part of him for too long. Not his wheat-colored hair or his eyes that Minnie said were hazel, but that I thought were the exact color of buckwheat honey, or the small freckle just above his lip. "Hey." The Loomis farm bordered ours. It was much bigger, 90 acres. They had more bog than we did, but Mr. Loomis and his boys had managed to clear 40 acres. We'd only got about 25 cleared. The best land, where we pulled stumps and rocks, we used for crops. Hay and corn for our animals, plus potatoes, some to keep and some to sell. Places where the stumps were still charred and rotting, or where it was rocky or boggy, Pa used to pasture the cows. The worst patches were planted with buckwheat, as it is not particular and will grow most anywhere. Pa had hoped to clear another 5 acres over the summer, but he couldn't without Lawton. Royal looked from me to Pleasant and back again. He let the wagon wheel slide to the ground. "Let me have him," he said, taking the reins. "Giddy up, you!" he shouted, snapping them smartly against Pleasant's rump. Much harder than I had. Pleasant budged. Boy, did he. Tommy, Beth, and Lou cheered, and I felt as dumb as a bag of hammers. Royal was the second eldest boy in his family. There were two younger ones. Daniel, the eldest, had just gotten engaged to Belinda Becker from the Farm and Feed Beckers in Old Forge. Belinda is a pretty name. It feels like meringue in your mouth or a curl of sugar on snow. Not like Matt. Matt is the sound of knots in a dog's coat or something you wipe your feet on. Dan and Belinda's engagement was big news. It was a good match, what with Dan so capable and Belinda sure of a nice dowry. My Aunt Josephine said there was supposed to have been a second engagement. She said Royal had been sweet on Martha Miller, whose father is the minister in Inlet, but he broke it off. Nobody knew why. But Aunt Josie said it was because Martha's people were Herkimer diamonds, which aren't diamonds at all, only look-alike crystals that aren't worth a darn. Mr. Miller has a nice pair of grays, and Martha wears pretty dresses, but they don't pay their bills. I didn't see what that had to do with engagements, but if anyone would know it, it was my aunt. She is an invalid and has nothing to entertain herself with other than gossip. She is on every scrap of hearsay like a bear on a brook trout. Dan and Royal were only a year apart, 19 and 18, and they were forever in competition. Whether it was a baseball game or who could pick the most berries or chop the most wood, one was always trying to outdo the other. I hadn't seen much of them over the last year. I used to visit with them when they came to fetch Lawton for fishing trips, and we all used to walk to school together, but Dan and Royal left school early. Neither one was much for book learning. I watched him as he plowed a row, turned at the end of the field, and came back. "Thanks, Royal," I mumbled. "I'll take him now." "That's all right. I'll finish it. Why don't you follow along behind and pull the stones?" I did as he said, traipsing after him, picking up stones and roots, carrying them in a bucket until I could dump them at the end of a row. "How are you doing back there?" he called after a few rows, turning to look at me. "Fine," I said, and then I tripped and dropped my bucket. He stopped, waited for me to right myself, then started off again. He moved fast, and it was hard to keep up with him. His furrows were straight and deep, much better than the ones I'd done. He made me feel clumsy in comparison, and flustered. Flumsy. "Soil's good, dark and rich." I looked down at it. It was as black as wet coffee grounds. "Yes, it is," I said. "Should get a good crop out of it. Why you call your mule pleasant? He's anything but." "It's a misnomer," I said, pleased to be able to use my word of the day. "You call your mule Miss Pleasant? It's a boy mule." "No, not Miss Pleasant. Misnomer. It means a misapplied name. Like when you call a fat person slim. Misnomer. It comes from me nommer, which is French, Old French, for to misname. It's my word of the day. I pick a word out of the dictionary every morning and memorize it and try to use it. It helps build vocabulary. I'm reading Jane Eyre right now, and I hardly ever have to look up a word. Misnomer, though, that's a hard one to use in conversation. But then when you asked about pleasant, and there it was, my perfect chance to... Royal gave me a look over his shoulder, a wincing, withering look that made me feel like the biggest babbling blabberer in all of Herkimer County. I closed my mouth and wondered what it was girls like Belinda Becker had to say that made boys want to listen to them. I knew a lot of words, a lot more than Belinda, who giggled all the time and said things like swell and chum and hopelessly dead broke, but not the right ones. I kept my eyes on the furrows for a while, but that got to be boring, so I stared at Royal's backside. I had never really noticed a man's backside before. Pa didn't have one. It was as flat as a cracker. Mama would tease him about it, and he'd tell her the lumber bosses worked it off him. I thought Royal's was very nice, round and proud, like 2 loaves of soda bread. He turned around just then, and I blushed. I wondered what Jane Eyre would have done, then realized Jane was English and proper and wouldn't have gone around eyeing Rochester's backside to begin with. "Where's your pa, anyway?" Royal asked. "With Daisy, who's calving, and Abby, who isn't. Calving, I mean." I wished I could stitch my mouth shut. There were more questions. What was Pa using for fertilizer? How many acres was he going to clear? Was he planting any potatoes this spring? What about buckwheat? And wasn't it hard for him to run the farm alone? He's not alone. He has me, I said. But you're still in school, ain't you? Why aren't you out yet anyway? School's for children and you're what, 15? 16. Where's Lawton? Ain't he coming back? You writing a column for the paper, Royal? Lou asked. Royal didn't laugh. I did, though. He was quiet after that. 2 hours later, he'd finished the field entirely. We sat down for a rest, and I gave him a piece of the Johnny cake I'd brought and poured him switchel from a stone jug. I gave pieces to Tommy and Lou and Beth as well. Royal watched Tommy eat his piece. Hubbards is always hungry, ain't they? Can't never seem to fill 'em up. He said, Why you here, Tom? Tommy looked at his Johnny cake, crumbly and yellow in his dirty hands. Like to help Maddie, I guess? Like to help her pa? Why'n't you help your own mama plow her field? We ain't got a plow, Tommy mumbled, a red flush creeping up his neck. Guess you don't need one, do you? She's always got someone plowing her field, ain't she, Tom? Cripes, Royal, what's Emmy's field to you? I said, not liking the hard look in his eyes or the miserable, cornered one in Tommy's. The Loomis boys were always agitating with the Hubbards, like a pack of hounds after possums. Lawton had gotten between the younger ones and Tommy on many occasions. Royal shrugged, then took a bite of his own cake. This is good, he said. I was about to tell him that Abby made it, but then his honey-colored eyes were on me, not the Johnny cake, and the hardness in them was gone, and I didn't. He looked at me closely, his head on an angle, and for a second I had the funniest feeling that he was going to open my jaws and look at my teeth or pick up my foot and wrap the bottom of it. I heard a shout and saw Pa waving from the barn. He walked up to us and sat down. I gave him my glass of switchel. Daisy had a bull calf, he said wearily, and then he smiled. My Pa was so handsome when he smiled, with his eyes as blue as cornflowers and his beautiful white teeth. He hardly did any more, and it felt like a hard rain letting up. Like Mama might come up from hanging wash and join us. Like Lawton might come out of the woods any second, his fishing pole over his shoulder. Beth, Lou, and Tommy chased off to see the new calf. Pa finished the switchel, and I poured him some more. Switchel is easier to drink than plain water when you are hot and thirsty. Mixing a little vinegar, ginger, and maple syrup into the water helps it to digest. Pa looked at Royal, his shirt soaked with sweat, and my hands, dirty from the stones, and Pleasant unhitched, and put it all together. I'm obliged to you, he said. It's a son's work, planting, not a daughter's. Thought I had a son to do it. Pa, I said quietly. Don't understand why he left. Couldn't tear me away from land like this, Royal said. I bristled at that. I was angry at Lawton for leaving too, but Royal was not family and therefore had no right to speak against him. Thing of it was, I didn't understand why my brother had left either. I knew they'd had a fight, he and Pa. I saw them going at one another in the barn. First fists, and then Pa had gone for his peavy. Then Lawton had run into the house, thrown his things into an old flour sack, and marched out again. I'd run after him, me and Lou both, but Pa stopped us. Let him go, he'd said, blocking our way down the porch steps. But Pa, you can't just let him walk out. It's the dead of winter, I pleaded. Where's he going to go? I said, let him go. Go back in the house. Go on. He pushed us inside, slammed the door, and locked it, as if he were afraid we would leave too. And afterward, he was so changed. It was as if we'd lost our father as well as our mother and brother. Some days later, I asked him what the fight was about, but he wouldn't tell me, and from the anger in his eyes, I knew better than to press. Royal and Pa talked about farming for a bit, and milk prices, and who was building yet another camp on Fourth Lake, or up the hill at Big Moose Lake, and how many guests it would hold, and how the market for cream and butter ought to go through the roof this season, and why would anyone buy the slop that came up on the trains from Remsen when they could now get fresh milk right here. Then Royal picked up his wagon wheel and said he had to get along to Burnup's. The iron tread was loose, and George Burnup was the only one nearby with a forge. After he left, I thought I might get a talking to for sitting and drinking switchel with him, but I didn't. Pa just gathered Pleasant's traces and walked him back to the barn, asking the mule if he had any idea why Frank Loomis had 4 good sons and he didn't have one. Alright, that's all we're going to be reading from this book, so if you want to know what happens next, you can check this book out at the library. It'll be available for checkout. And next week, come join us again for a brand new story. Thanks for joining me. Have a great weekend. Bye.